Dark Secrets of the Kenyan Presidency, Chapter 3, Suffering of Daniel Arap Moi. Daniel Arap Moi was the man who took over power from Kenyatta, and to the surprise of many, ended up ruling for 24 years, much longer than Kenyatta, and faced with many more serious challenges than his predecessor. But who was Moi? Tracing his political climb will give us some pointers. After Jaramogi Oginga Odinga resigned in a huff from the Kenyatta administration, actually was forced out without being told directly to leave, and this was done by political frustration and pressure, which was masterminded by one Tom Mboya. After Jaramogi left, Kenyatta appointed Joseph Zuzate Murumbi as the new vice president. Now, Kenya's second vice president was a fascinating character, and it's very sad that too little has been written about him. Okay, part of the reason is the fact that the man kept his mouth firmly shut until his death in 1990 at the age of 79. So he did not talk much about what really happened. And if he did, it was never made public. It is said that Murumbi was the offspring of a Goan trader and a Maasai mother, but spent the first 16 years of his life in India. After that, he traveled the world extensively, and at one time worked in London as press and tourist officer at the Moroccan embassy. Mystery has always surrounded Murumbi's sudden resignation on August 31st, 1966, after serving as VP for only 15 months. The truth is that it had a lot to do with disillusionment for one who had very high ideals when they gave themselves to serving their beloved motherland. To understand the whole scenario better, picture a typical Kenyan today in the diaspora who gets a chance to get involved in the politics of their homeland. And this is after years of working and living abroad. Naturally, that kind of person is bound to be extremely patriotic and eager to do good for their country. They are also likely to be very idealistic in their approach to things. Now, you can begin to understand the disillusionment Murumbi must have encountered as VP to a president who, together with equally bloodthirsty, selfish individuals surrounding him, were amassing land and wealth like there was no tomorrow. But the final straw for Murumbi was probably the discovery, years after it had happened, that his close friend Pio Gama Pinto had been murdered by the Kiambu Mafia, and that he was actually partly responsible for that death. And he was responsible by confidently calling him out of hiding, as we have seen in an earlier chapter of this book. Lawyer Feroz Norji agrees, and he says, the assassination of Pinto illustrated to Murumbi the shocking extent to which the new government had departed from its promises. His feeling, evidently, was that these were not the values for which so many had suffered, and from then on, his departure was effectively only a matter of time. End of quote. Now, Pinto was assassinated on February 25th, 1965, and Murumbi was not yet VP at the time. So what is meant here is that Murumbi was already disillusioned with the Kenyatta government before his appointment as VP, and probably thought that he would change things as the second in command. It is also possible that Murumbi would not have known for sure who ordered the hit on Pinto until he had served several months as vice president, where he was bound to come across a lot more privileged information than an ordinary minister would ordinarily have access to. Now, of course, Pinto was a cabinet minister before his appointment as vice president. And so after Murumbi, Daniel Arap Moi was appointed in late 1966. How the Moi appointment was decided is rather fascinating and well worth revealing here. Then powerful AG, Attorney General Charles Njonjo, was traveling in the presidential limousine with President Kenyatta somewhere close to Nakuru. Njonjo was making suggestions of possible VPs, and Kenyatta was dismissing them one by one. Names like Tom Mboya rolled off Njonjo's lips, but it was obvious why such a person would never be appointed. Kenyatta had learnt his lesson with Jaramogi Oginga Odinga, and basically what he was looking for was a non-threatening to the presidency person who would also be a political asset in some way. When Jonjo's top choices ran out, he started mentioning names of everybody and anybody could think of, and each time Kenyatta shook his head. Then he mentioned Moi. Kenyatta stopped him, hesitated for a few seconds in deep thought, and then smiled and nodded his head in approval. In the months and years to follow, Moi helped Kenyatta to settle many Kikuyus in the Rift Valley amongst its Kalenjin community, after their prime land in Central Province had been taken over by Kenyatta and his close associates. So in that respect, he was a great asset to Kenyatta in planting the seeds of the terrible tribal bloody clashes that were to come later and long after Jomo Kenyatta's death. But being VP was not a bed of roses for Moi. Far from it. Indeed, several times he even complained to Kenyatta, and he complained about the harassment he was suffering in the hands of the dreaded Kiambu Mafia. Kenyatta did nothing. There were even times when Moi would lead a Kenyan delegation to some conference abroad, but end up being totally ignored at best, and at worst, taking orders from others in the delegation who were in reality much more powerful than he was. Like Dr. Njoroge Mungai, for instance, who was a foreign affairs minister for many years. But the frustration did not stop there, and in fact, it extended to personal abuse. In one very humiliating incident, Moi returned from a foreign trip to be cornered by James Mungai, who was then Assistant Commissioner of Police in charge of Rift Valley Province, and he was based in Nakuru, where Kenyatta spent most of his time. Mungai is said to have been related to Kenyatta, and as a result, wielded enormous clout despite merely being the top cop in charge of Rift Valley Province. It is said that Mungai told Moi that he suspected that he had come back into the country with guns to overthrow Kenyatta. And so, he subjected Moi to the kind of search that only prison inmates have to go through. What that means is that somebody is stripped naked, and the place down there where inmates hide all kinds of stuff is searched thoroughly. It is said that Moi felt that this was too much and complained directly to Kenyatta. Kenyatta answered by asking a question. Who is the minister in charge of police? At that time, of course, Moi had the Home Affairs docket, and the police was under that ministry. It is instructive that later, Moi himself transferred the police to the office of the president. That's when he took over power. Anyway, Moi replied to Kenyatta's question that he was the minister in charge of the police. And that was the end of that conversation. Moi went through many other intensely humiliating experiences as VP. To his credit, he weathered the storm and managed to remain humble and persevering. And although he came very close to resigning on one or two occasions, he held on to the post until Kenyatta's death on August 22, 1978. It is worth noting that Moi's upbringing in very harsh conditions, where he had to trek for many miles to school at the beginning of the term, carrying a heavy suitcase, or box as Kenyans like to call it, helped shape his character and especially his patience and perseverance. There is absolutely no doubt that many others would have crumbled under the pressure and even committed suicide. That is how bad it was. Interestingly, until the last minute, Moi did not have any ambitions for the presidency of Kenya, despite being VP for so long. In fact, one of the compelling factors that convinced him to hold on to the post, with the suffering that went with it, was the fact that he knew too much, and it was clear that the Kiambu Mafia would not be comfortable with him out of government and still alive, considering how much he knew. It was very likely that on his resignation from government, he would have either died or just disappeared without trace, as was the norm in those early years. I am personally convinced that there was divine intervention in Moi's survival and ascension to the presidency. Sample the following. There was a paramilitary group formed called the Ngoroko. This unit was set up after the change the constitution bid by the Kiambu Mafia failed. It was their plan B. The Ngoroko's mission was simple. On the death of Kenyatta, they were supposed to wipe out all opposition to one of the members of the Kiambu Mafia taking over the presidency. It was obvious that on Kenyatta's death, orders would be relayed to the paramilitary group through Mbiu Koinange, who was always at the president's side as a key member of the Kiambu Mafia. Koinange was a minister of state in the office of the president. Now, on the night that Kenyatta died in Mombasa, Koinange was away in business in Nairobi. He had flown out that very evening. And that was the very first time he was not at the president's side in almost 15 years. Still, word leaked out somehow that Kenyatta was dead, and roadblocks were set up near Nakuru because it was known that Moi was at his farm in Kabarak. It was critical that Moi got back to Nairobi to summon a cabinet meeting and for AG Charles Njonjo to ensure that the constitution was followed to the letter in transferring power temporarily to the vice president. Moi abandoned his official car and instead was bundled into the boot of a very old Peugeot 404 that he usually used to use around the farm. That is how he got past a deadly Ngoroko roadblock and made it back to Nairobi. For those who know what an old Peugeot 404 looks like, it is a car with a rather large boot. Still, Moi is a very tall man, and it must have been very, very uncomfortable traveling most of the way back to Nairobi inside the dusty boot of that car. Some analysts have always discounted the Ngoroko story, and the intelligence chief at that time, the late James Kanyotu, fed a story to the media claiming that he had a hand in assuring that Biu Koinange was not at Kenyatta's side on the night of his death. Kanyotu claimed that it was he who lured Koinange away using some story about a foreign investor wanting to meet him in Nairobi. The story is compelling, but has some glaring loose ends dangling. For instance, it would suggest that Kanyotu knew exactly when Kenyatta would die and put his plan of action into motion on the exact night. Now, that would make Kanyotu either an assassin or more than a mere mortal, something not even the most gullible Kenyan should buy. Reluctant to take power. Again, it is said that after the first cabinet meeting, Moi was terrified and confided in Njonjo that he did not feel that he was able to step into Kenyatta's shoes. Hawa wa Kikuyu wataniua. Loosely translated, these Kikuyus will kill me. Moi is said to have told Njonjo in Kiswahili, whilst almost in tears. Njonjo quietly explained that he would personally stand by his side and help him settle into the presidency, and would ensure that he was protected from any would-be assassins. Moi reluctantly accepted, and in many ways this explains the power that Njonjo wielded in the early Moi years, where he would ride in the presidential limousine with Moi, Gigi Karaoke and Nicholas Biwott practically all the time. At one point, Kenyans would mockingly refer to the three politicians as Moi's three wives. Amazingly, on taking over power, Kenya's second president was ready to forgive all this suffering that he had gone through. But as we shall see later on in this prose, something dramatic would happen that would completely change his approach to the presidency and begin a reign of terror in Kenya that almost rivaled the Kenyatta years. The very first cabinet meeting after Kenyatta's death, which was held on August 22, 1978, was a very fascinating affair, to say the least. During Kenyatta's presidency, the entire cabinet would usually assemble and wait for the president to arrive for the meeting. Conversation around the table would usually be in Kikuyu during this wait. This forced Moi, who was an Ilot, and the very few other non-Kikuyus in the cabinet to learn the Bantu tongue of the Kikuyus. Many times the cabinet would wait in vain for Kenyatta, only to be told that he was not coming, usually due to health reasons. Now on this historic day of August 22, 1978, all the cabinet members were there, and this time they were waiting for somebody who had been one of them only the day before, and somebody whom they had always derided. Moi did not keep the cabinet waiting and came in shortly after they were all there, accompanied by AG Charles Njonjo. All eyes were on him as he sat at the head of the table where only Kenyatta had sat before. Moi's eyes were red and he looked like he had been crying. For a brief moment, members of the presidential press unit were allowed inside the room to take photographs, which they did, and then they left. Moi had a very difficult task ahead of him. Njonjo made it easy by making it almost unnecessary for him to speak, although he was chairing that historic cabinet meeting. The main agenda for the day was of course the arrangements for the state funeral for Jomo Kenyatta the following weekend. Still, Moi felt overwhelmed by the challenges ahead of him. The constitution at the time stated that in the event of the death of the president, the vice president would take over for a period of 90 days, 3 months, pending elections for a new president. 3 months is a long time, and Moi must have had his uncertainties over ever retaining the presidency. More so if you take into consideration the curious incident with Georgia which I've just recounted, where he declared in tears that he was incapable of taking over the presidency, that he felt very threatened by the Kiambu Mafia. Hao Wakikuyu wataniua was what he had said. Now, during that first cabinet meeting with him as president, it is said that Moi avoided eye contact with most of those seated in the cabinet room with him. Amongst them were people who had plotted his murder only a few hours earlier to ensure that he would never rise to the presidency. The two men he must have feared most on that table that day were Dr. Njoroge Mungai and Biu Koinange. Interestingly, the plotting of most political murders was associated with the former, who was often referred to by his fellow Kiambu Mafia colleagues as Mr. Fix-It. Biu Koinange, grandfather to Jeff Koinange, a prominent media personality, was the most feared and respected member of the Kiambu Mafia, more so because of his closeness to the old man. Both were very powerful and influential members of Kenyatta's inner circle, with plenty of blood on their hands. And both had no doubt thought about this day many, many times over the years. But not in their wildest dreams or even nightmares did they ever imagine that Daniel Arap Moi would be seated at the head of the table in Kenyatta's usual chair in the cabinet room chairing a meeting as acting president of the Republic of Kenya. If truth is to be told, Moi's fears were not unfounded. It is widely believed that both men were intimately linked to the hit on Tom Mboya in July 1969. Some sources even claim that the two went behind Kenyatta's back and ordered it. They further claimed that Kenyatta was livid after he found out, but there was nothing he could do about it. This is highly unlikely to be true. As we have already seen earlier in this book, it is highly unlikely that a hit as significant as Mboya's would have been executed without Kenyatta's personal nod. Still, the two individuals were said to be very ambitious and determined that the presidency should fall into their hands on Kenyatta's death. At one point, Njoroge Mungai is even said to have bluntly asked Kenyatta to name him as his successor. As Moi sat quietly officiating over his very first cabinet meeting, the foreign press was speculating that the real matata, political chaos and violence, would promptly start after Kenyatta's funeral. And when the presidential elections were announced, it was expected that a member of the Kiambu Mafia would vie for the presidency against Moi. Others remembered Jaramogi Oginga Odinga, who was also known to be very interested in the presidency. Indeed, Odinga had turned up to view Kenyatta's body at State House, and with cameras from the local and international press rolling, he had proceeded to utter many words in Doluo over the body while waving his fly whisk. Those who did not understand the language speculated that he was thanking the gods for the death of a man he had lifted to the presidency, only for him to be later dumped by the same ungrateful man. For these reasons, there was a lot of tension in the country at the time. Very few would have guessed that at the end there would be no election because nobody would oppose Moi, and he was confirmed as the second president of Kenya. So the obvious question here is, where did all the pretenders to the throne disappear to? It is not clear exactly what happened, but an interesting meeting of the Kiambu Mafia shortly after Kenyatta's death, attended by Kamba politician Paul Ngei, may give us a few pointers. It is reported that most members of the Kiambu Mafia at the meeting felt that Moi was not a threat, and there was no hurry for them to make a move because he was simply a passing cloud. Paul Ngei strongly disagreed with them and told them that the presidency was a very powerful seat, and if they allowed Moi to be president even for a couple of weeks, they would never be able to remove him. It is not clear what Ngei was suggesting that the Kiambu Mafia do to remove Moi immediately, because whatever it was, it would have been unconstitutional. Note that the Kiambu Mafia were not known for ignoring the constitution in their quest for the presidency. Anyway, to the Kiambu Mafia at the time, anybody else as an interim president would have been a threat, but surely not Moi of all people. The man who had succumbed to so much humiliation, including a searching of his very private parts by a Mayor Assistant Commissioner of Police when he was VP. The guy did not even speak English too well. And this is what had forced some members of the Kenyatta's inner circle to take over proceedings and leadership of delegations from him during those foreign trips. To stop him shaming Kenya, they claimed. They had been ashamed of Moi. Moi did not even look intelligent at all, and some felt that Kenya was being painted in a bad picture with such a man as vice president and leader of the Kenyan delegation. Now it is important to note that throughout his presidency, Jomo Kenyatta never boarded an aircraft, and so Moi had to represent him in all foreign trips where the president was required to attend, and those were very many trips in those days. The long and short of it is that what Ngei was saying about Moi being a threat was laughable to most members of the Kiambu Mafia, and those who thought they knew Moi fairly well. In retrospect, one can say that they may have known Moi, but hardly knew the office of the President of Kenya, which would transform Moi into a man at times almost as ruthless as they had been. Now, when you take this information and consider it along other information about the bitter power struggle that was going on amongst Kenyatta's insiders, it all points to the fact that this decision by the Kiambu Mafia to take their time and accept Moi as a sole compromise candidate for interim president is what dealt a death blow to the ambitions of many for the presidency. The role of the then AG Charles Njonjo in helping the new president quickly settle down and consolidate his position is yet another major reason. In the end, Paul Ngei's words were to prove to be very prophetic indeed. In this context, it is now very easy to understand why so many political analysts divide the Moi presidency very neatly into two. Just like his predecessor, Moi started with very high ideals and was very determined to make a difference. Admittedly, Moi's honeymoon lasted a lot longer than Kenyatta's. It lasted a whole 3 years, as opposed to the few months Kenyatta had before he started having nightmares of him and his family being executed in some firing squad after a successful coup in Kenya. And as we shall see later in this narrative, this is exactly the same thing that happened to Moi, only that in his case, he would have to face a real coup to have a complete change of heart. Moi's early years as a pussyfoot president. What is the difference between a novel and a movie? Well, a novel tells or narrates and a movie shows. This is why a boring movie is the one where there's too much narrative telling and too little showing. A great movie is where you know the characters by what you see them doing. I dare add that an exciting book or novel is one that shows in narrative rather than just telling. Basically, you understand the story much better from seeing. This is why making silent movies without sound is an ideal way to train a budding filmmaker. In this regard, the following eyewitness account of an incident involving President Daniel Arap Moi somewhere in Machakos in 1979 is worth recounting here because it shows a lot. Moi had taken over the reins of power on August 22, 1978 and had been confirmed as President of Kenya before the end of the stipulated 3-month period on October 10, 1978, meaning that presidential elections had been called earlier, and there being no candidate to oppose him as president, he had been declared president. Now, early in his presidency, Moi had launched a massive campaign for reforestation and soil conservation in the country. He had even gone as far as forming a special permanent presidential commission on soil conservation and had appointed Kisii politician and former Nyaribari Chache legislator Zephania Anyeni to chair it. Kenyans were being treated to a very different hands-on development-oriented presidency. Now on this particular morning, the president was somewhere in Machakos, helping to build gabion reinforcements to protect the already badly eroded hillside. The exercise involved a long line of people passing along heavy stones which ended up in the president's hands and he would toss them down into the wire mesh. Though a couple of other carefully selected people, I guess there was fear that somebody would hurl a heavy stone at the president in some far-fetched assassination plot. Anyway, there were a carefully selected group of people at the end of the line throwing the stones in as well. A large crowd had gathered to witness this very curious sight. Until then, Kenyans were used to a laid-back president who was greatly feared and rarely seen in public. Now they had a president who worked in the hot sun with ordinary folk. The exercise continued for at least 2 hours, from 11 in the morning until almost 1 p.m. By this time, the hot Ukambani sun was beating down ferociously on the president, and his large and extremely dark frame was drenched in sweat. Yet, he showed no signs of quitting. Kenyans at that time knew very little about Moi, apart from the fact that he was the vice president who spoke with a strong Kalenjin accent. There was evidence that because of the accent, many did not take him too seriously. For years, the epitome of local comedy in Kenya was to have some funny guy speak Kiswahili or English in a heavy accent from some tribe in Kenya. Now, some of the stones obviously had sharp edges, jutting out of them. And while lifting one, Moi gashed his fingers and blood started flowing out. What followed next was pandemonium. The president's security detail quickly surrounded him, and somebody started barking instructions as policemen rapidly spoke into their two-way radios. It seemed that the president's entire motorcade did not have a first aid kit, at least in those days. Within minutes, an ambulance arrived on the scene at high speed and with sirens blaring. The President of the Republic of Kenya received some first aid, but resisted all attempts to quickly usher him away from the scene. He later addressed a large public gathering where his speech dwelt on the need to conserve the environment and develop Kenya rapidly. "We're on the run," he told Kenyans. The President's security detail is supposed to protect His Excellency at all times, but they do like to dramatize things a little sometimes, mainly for effect, and that day they succeeded big time. Still, the main point here is that Kenya had a very different kind of president, and he would not have been more of a contrast to his predecessor. Kenyatta was commanding, authoritative, and a big bully sometimes. Moi was reserved, humble, and almost shy of exercising his powers as President of the Republic of Kenya and Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. The new president still rode in his long, dark limousine with his 3 wives, namely Charles Njonjo, Gigi Karaoke, and Nicholas Biwott. Some analysts believe that these were the real presidents of Kenya in those early Moi days, and no executive decisions were made without this council of elders. Moi was still terrified of the Kikuyu, and in particular the Kiambu Mafia, and insiders say that he spent many months thinking of ways of neutralizing them, or at least keeping them in check. At that time, there were no political detainees in the country because Moi had released all of them and on taking over power, and it was clear that he greatly detested Kenyatta's strong-arm tactics of ruling and was looking for a different, more amicable way to rule Kenya. One of the early ingenious schemes that the new president was advised to follow was to appoint his people, meaning people he could trust, to be deputies in major institutions he wanted to keep a close eye on, especially in the security forces. It was a very quiet way of spreading his influence. The deputy head of any institution is bound to be very much aware of what is going on within the institution, sometimes even more aware than the person heading it. Later, this tactic was modified, and the deputies were always members of the president's Kalenjin community. But this was after the failed coup of 1982, when, as I have said before, a new and very different Moi emerged. But in those early days, Moi still kept Kenyatta's appointees, at least most of them, in place, changing only the police commissioner amongst a few others. Now, the removal of the police commissioner is worth recounting here because it shows early glimpses of the post-1982 Moi that Kenyans were to grow to fear. It also introduces a fascinating character who was a key figure in executing numerous bloody Kiambu Mafia hits during the Kenyatta reign. Then Police Commissioner Bernard Higa was summoned to State House by Moi, who was upset about a certain security-related issue. Higa was from Kiambu and very close to various members of the dreaded Kiambu Mafia. He was even related to Njoroge, Mr. Fix-It, Mungai. It is said that Higa did not respond to the new president in the same way he used to respond to Kenyatta. He did not answer back to Kenyatta. Yet Higa took time to strongly disagree with what the new president was saying and to defend himself vigorously. A visibly annoyed Moi ordered him back to his office in Vigilance House. However, when Higa entered his office, he found Ben Gedhi already seated on his chair. This would only have meant that Moi had spoken to Gedhi even before Higa had arrived in State House for his meeting with the president. Any other officer Higa would have promptly thrown out, but this was Gedhi, and even Higa, who was supposed to be his boss, feared him. The following were Hinga's exact words: "What the hell is going on?" Ben Gedhi informed him that he had just been appointed police commissioner by the president. Higa pointed out that he had just been to see the president and he hadn't been told about this new development. Just then, the phone rang, and Moi personally talked to Higa, asking him to take an early retirement. Ben Gedhi himself was a fascinating character who was used to do a number of dirty jobs for the Kiambu Mafia. Now, if you have taken in my documentary series on the assassination of Tom Mboya, you will know that it was Ben Gedhi who pulled the trigger and fired the 2 shots that killed Mboya. Anyway, Gedhi was also an explosives expert, maybe the most qualified in the country at that time. And it is no coincidence that shortly before JM was murdered in 1975, a bomb went off at OTC, upcountry bus company associated with the defunct Kenya Bus Services, which was operating under the name Overseas Trading Company, OTC. Now, the bomb killed 27 people and maimed many others. You don't need to think very hard to guess who was behind the heinous act on innocent citizens of Kenya. Now, it is said that JM Karaoke had actually planned to travel in Mombasa, and somebody had even already booked tickets on that particular bus for JM Karaoke to travel secretly to Mombasa. The reason for that was that JM Karaoke feared for his life, and therefore he was planning to get away from the city to rethink his options. Well, somehow JM Karaoke never made it to that bus, but still 27 Kenyans died in his place. Interestingly, another mysterious bomb went off at Norfolk Hotel on New Year's Eve 1980, killing around 27 people, again, mostly American and British tourists. To date, this mystery has also never been solved, although Gedhi was at the time the police commissioner. It should be noted that he was Israeli trained and still had very close links with the Israelis. Even more telling is the fact that there was no follow-up by the government on this very serious incident, almost as if the mystery was solved in their book. Gedhi himself was fired as police commissioner shortly after the 1982 coup attempt and was briefly detained without charge. He was released after about 1 year in police cells. Shortly before Ben Gedhi's sacking, Raila Odinga says in his biography that he burst into the cells where Raila and others were being held, looking drunk and eating roasted goat leg. He interrogated Raila, and his colleagues and supervisors as GSU officers assaulted them with kicks and blows. Ben Gedhi was quite a character. He would sit at a corner of some crowded bar, drinking alone for hours on end. It was usually a stiff whiskey drink. He hardly talked, and it was clear that the man was being haunted by many ghosts from his past. Indeed, many African cultures firmly believe that if you shed too much innocent blood, there is no way you can avoid being haunted by the spirits of those you have murdered. If this is true, then it explains Gedhi's strange behavior and character. Gedhi died in 1994 from some illness. People say he probably just drank himself to death and took with him to the grave enough secrets to write hundreds of best-selling books. This includes inside details of the planning and execution of the mission that assassinated Tom Mboya. Reliance on Jonjo. There is no doubt that in the early years of his administration, Moi relied a lot on the AG whom he had inherited from Kenyatta, and the man most responsible for his ascension to the presidency, one Charles Mugabe Njonjo. But already there was pressure from his Kalenjin community and the elders from within the community to the effect that he was just too trusting of Njonjo. After all, Njonjo was a Kikuyu, and it was known that they could not be trusted. There is evidence that some of the pressure was coming from one of his 3 wives, who also hailed from the president's Kalenjin community, namely a man called Nicholas Kipiator Biwott, whom most Kenyans had never heard of at that point. Biwott had worked for Kenya's first agriculture minister, Bruce Mackenzie, as a personal assistant, and had, as a result, gained numerous useful contacts. Mackenzie was actually a spy and operative for at least 2 different major foreign powers, the Israelis' dreaded Mossad and the British MI6. The connection with the Israelis seemed to have rubbed off on Biwott, and not only did he end up getting married to an Israeli woman as one of his many wives, but Biwott's personal security detail is, and has always been, mostly Israeli. Interestingly, there is plenty of proof to suggest that Biwott also used personnel from that country for his dirty jobs locally, like killing people during the Moi administration. Now, all people who were connected in one way or the other to the assassination of Ouko, as witnesses or people who knew something about it, were all murdered or died under mysterious circumstances. Now, it's widely believed that those assassinations were fulfilled mainly with the help of Biwott's crack Israeli security personnel. It is also instructive that Bruce Mackenzie, whom Biwott used to work for, did not die a natural death, but was actually assassinated during the Kenyatta presidency and when he was no longer in the cabinet. He went to visit Uganda's President Idi Amin Dada at the time on a trip which was designed to mend fences with the Ugandan dictator. Mackenzie was well received, and Idi Amin gave him a gift of some sculpture which he carried back to the plane with him. The gift actually contained explosives which went off when the small plane was in the air, coming back to Nairobi. Killing Mackenzie, it was clear that the man greatly underestimated Idi Amin and paid for it with his life. But back to my main tale. Despite all the pressures, Moi did not act at all. He remained quite humble, a tolerant president who still had no political detainees. But as the year 1982 drew to its midway mark, Moi started receiving a lot of reports from the intelligence community about heightened secret political activity in the country. Still, his closest advisor on security matters, one Charles Mugabe Njonjo, reassured him that all was well. After all, what could people do apart from make noise and harmless political plots? The presidency was powerful enough to easily deal with any such threats, as Njonjo told him. He went on to remind him how they had used the legal powers of the presidency to deal with all the threats to the presidency thus far. And so Moi ignored his Kalenjin king, and some people say even his own instincts. Indeed, it is not too difficult to believe that Moi's instincts were impeccable and had helped him to survive the 12 horrendous years as vice president. If there's something about Moi's character that few can argue about, then it is his ability to survive by sensing bad things that are coming in good time. And so it is safe to assume that his instincts must have been screaming at him that a storm was brewing in the horizon, a storm that would seek to take his life, and in any event, one that would cause a lot of Kenyan blood to be spilled. Now, in the next chapter, we'll deal with the event that changed Moi forever. Okay? The coup attempt in August 1982. Don't miss it.